All right, so today we're going to actually talk about section 6.3 in the textbook, which is essentially going over ATP hydrolysis. And this is something that's very important in cellular energy and the transfer of energy. So when we're talking about cells, they actually do three main kinds of work. Chemical work, where they're transporting chemicals and creating chemicals, using chemicals to do things. Transport, where they're moving things across the cell membrane. We learned a lot about that. And then also mechanical work, anything that involves movement. And a lot of times when we are talking about cells doing work, we need to think about how they actually carry out those processes. And one way they do this is through something called energy coupling. So as you might recall, some processes, which are exergonic, release energy, while as others, the endergonic processes, require energy. And for most of the jobs they have to do in biology, cells will couple exergonic processes to release energy to drive one that requires energy. And most of this energy coupling is mediated by ATP in the cell. This is kind of your immediate source of energy that can power cellular work. And a good way to think about ATP is like money or cash. So for example, instead of having to go through the whole process of making your lunch, a lot of times people will buy their lunch. They'll pay for it. So ATP is kind of like this smaller, quick currency that cells can use. Most of the energy cells take in is too big for them to actually find useful, and so they'll use ATP as a quick energy exchange to get the jobs done that they need. So what actually is ATP? ATP is composed of three different things. Number one, a ribose, and you'll recognize from the ending OSE that that's a sugar. Adenine, which is one of our nitrogenous bases we learned about that also are part of DNA and RNA. And then finally, the three phosphate groups. So this is a 3D view of ATP, as well as a molecular view of ATP, the stick model. But I think that you will most likely recognize these pictures the most. Let's see. Hold on a second. There we go. So I think you'll find these pictures are the most recognizable. You'll recognize the carbon sugar with the C's, H's, and O's. That's one of our carbohydrates. Here's adenine, our nitrogenous base, and as you can see, it has an amino group here, very useful to recognize it. And then our three phosphate groups, and these are just our phosphate functional groups you'll recognize. But since there are three of them, we call ATP, its real name is adenine triphosphate. So there's one adenine and three phosphate molecules, and that's how we get our ATP structure. Typically, when ATP is hydrolyzed, what we see happening is their addition of water breaks these bonds and causes it to become adenosine diphosphate. So if you notice, di means two, and in that hydrolysis we end up with two phosphate molecules. Here's a closer look at ATP. Once again, we've got our ribose sugar, our adenine, and our three phosphate molecules. So during hydrolysis, this is a process that yields free energy, ADP, and an inorganic phosphate ion. And the release of this energy comes from a chemical change to the lower state of free energy as opposed to the phosphate bonds themselves. Energy is released from ATP when the terminal phosphate bond, the one on the end, is broken. And this is an exergonic reaction. So like I said, it releases energy. And if you take a look in this photo, this kind of breaks it down for you even more. But this end phosphate bond is broken by the addition of the water molecule, and we end up with adenosine 1,2 diphosphate, this inorganic phosphate molecule, and energy. So the reason why so much energy is released from ATP hydrolysis is because of the repulsive force of the 3 negatively charged phosphate groups. And the PO bonds in the inorganic phosphate molecule are stronger and more stable than the P oxygen bond in the phosphate groups in ATP. So because you're moving from that change in energy, the energy released by the formation of the new inorganic phosphate bond is greater than the energy required to break the bond in ATP. So you have a negative delta G, Gibbs free energy like we talked about, and that reaction is spontaneous. So the 3 uses for this, number 1 is that it produces heat. So for example, when you shiver, that's mechanical work happening, and that uses ATP hydrolysis to get your muscles to contract and warm your body up. We also use ATP and the hydrolysis of ATP to drive chemical reactions in the cell. So like we talked about at the beginning, a lot of the reactions that have to happen in your body start with the hydrolysis of ATP or incorporate the hydrolysis of ATP into a particular step, because you're releasing that energy that can be used, like it says here, to drive the reactions that require energy. And then another type of way that ATP is used in your cell is when we have ATP hydrolysis as used for transport in the cell. And if you recall, active transport requires energy, and where it gets that energy is from this ATP hydrolysis. So that's another way that we can use ATP in the cell. When we're talking about the intermediate reactions and the exergonic reactions driving endergonic reactions, one common one that we'll talk about a lot this unit is called phosphorylation. And this is essentially the transfer of a phosphate group to another molecule, such as one of the reactants. And the molecule that receives that intermediate phosphate is much more reactive. This is called a phosphorylated intermediate. That's the one that received the phosphate group from the ATP. And this releases a lot of energy, and in doing so can power other reactions that require energy. So this is oftentimes an intermediate step in much longer chain reactions. So for example, when we add glutamic acid and ammonia together, we are converting it to glutamine. This is the overall chemical reaction, but an intermediate step requires the addition of ATP that produces this phosphorylated intermediate. So notice one of the phosphates gets added to the glutamine. So you lost a phosphate. Once again, this becomes adenosine diphosphate. And then this gives us the energy that we need to allow the ammonia to come in and proceed with the reaction. We need some energy here. The reaction that happens here with ATP releases about 7.3 kilocalories per mole, whereas for the initial reaction to happen on its own, we would need 3.4 kilocalories per mole. So notice that ATP helps give us the negative delta G. One last important piece of information is about the regeneration of ATP. So this is a renewable resource in the cell, and ATP is regenerated by the addition of a phosphate group to an ADP, so essentially just the reverse reaction. And the energy required for this process, this is an endergonic process, because you remember the reverse is exergonic. This is important because that energy to phosphorylate ADP comes from the catabolic reactions in the cell. So the cell uses ATP to do all sorts of jobs, and once the cell is able to do its breaking down of different things, that's able to provide the energy that's required for ATP to be regenerated from ADP. So it's kind of a consistent cycle. ATP is consistently moving as energy. It gets transferred to start a reaction, and then that reaction will break something down and provide additional energy for ATP to be regenerated. And this is kind of a photographic form you can see here. You can see here we've got our energy coming in, which allows our ATP and our water. When water's added, that releases energy for cellular work and produces ADP plus your inorganic phosphate. And then once those cellular jobs are happening, they're breaking things down, they release energy, and that provides the energy needed for the reverse process to regenerate ATP. And so that's a little about ATP. Thank you.